Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 21st of September 2021. What year am I in? I don't know. It feels like last year again. Good to see you all on. And thanks very much for spending some time on this evening. Just before I bring Robbie in, I will just make my normal points, which is that we don't provide financial legal advice on this channel. This is a generic conversation. If you need more specific advice, you need to go and talk to professionals. Do please play nice in the chat room, especially tonight with so many on. We will moderate as needed. And I also would just make the point that there are often many conversations going on in the chat. I do try to follow them all, but I don't necessarily always manage to do that. So I apologise in advance if, in fact, I miss some things that are going on. This is as at 21st of September 2021. If you want to get my attention and make sure that your question gets noticed, use @WhatTheWorld. And we also have a super chat enabled, which means that if you want to make a contribution to helping run the show, you can do that. Or indeed, if you want to make sure your question goes to the top of the list, the super chat enabled questions are in a separate queue here, which means there's more chance I'm going to see them and more chance that we're going to answer them. But again, with all of these things, with so many questions on, the fact of the matter is, I may miss something. If I do, I apologise, but I try my best. Anyhow, with that introduction, I'm going to bring Robbie Barwick in. Robbie, are you there?
I am. Hello, Malcolm.
Close, but no cigar.
Martin, my friend. Martin.
Exactly right. Yeah, we've only done this a few times, but no, that's fine. It's it's evening. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for coming on and spending some time with us, Robbie.
Yeah, no problem. Before we begin, Martin, I thought I might do a bit of a welcome to country, but I'd like to acknowledge the future owners of this land, which will be our Chinese overlords, who are going to use it as a nuclear waste dump once they've reduced it to nuclear ash in the future war we just started. And I'm only half joking, but we can talk about that later.
Okay, straight in, 2 feet first. Thank you, Robbie. Yeah, we will come on, I think, to that particular discussion because it's an important discussion. But what I'd like to do is perhaps start in sort of more focus perhaps on the economic questions, because we did call this, it's the economy stupid, quoting I think Bill Clinton from some time ago. But just for those who may not know, why don't you just introduce yourself and just give you a bit of context, because of course you do have a significant full-time role in what you're doing with the Citizens Party.
Yeah, I'm the research director of the Citizens Party. The Citizens Party is the probably the most established of all the so-called minor political parties in Australia. Have been going more than 33 years this year, I believe. So we're not a fly-by-night party. We've been pretty much battling on the same issues for those 33 years, which is for a financial system that serves the real economy. Hence the subject of tonight's discussion. And in that time, we've seen the rise and fall of the neoliberal ideology, and it is falling, but it's hanging on for grim death, and we're paying the consequences of that. But we're helping to lead campaigns that can, pry its cold dead fingers off what's left of the economy, so we can actually, kickstart the heart of it again and get our economy back on track.
Right, and I think that's a really good place to start, Robert, because the key question for me is, what is the economy for? Who's it meant to serve? And how do you know you've got an economy that's actually working effectively, right? I think that's a good place to start, because my own view at the moment is our economy here in Australia is not functioning to the benefit of most Australians. It's supporting some significant power blocks, the construction sector, the mining sector, the finance sector, et cetera, et cetera. So how would you define success from an economic perspective?
Well, I've got a good metric I think people could consider, and we put this out in a release a week or so ago. Until 2020, the main economic refrain of both major parties in government was so many years of uninterrupted economic growth Australia has enjoyed, a world record. And I think we've got up to 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth. So, close to 3 decades of uninterrupted economic growth. And we put out a release about the state of the healthcare system because in 1980, Australia had nearly 7 beds per 1,000 people. In 2017, the last figures we found, it was just above 3 beds per 1,000 people. And we posed the question, if we'd enjoyed this world record burst of economic growth, why didn't our healthcare capacity expand? Why didn't it go from 7 beds to 10 beds, 11 beds, 12 beds per 1,000? Why don't we have well-equipped hospitals in every region of Australia? Doesn't matter how remote, with ICUs and all those kind of things, right? No, what we had, the same politicians telling us how much growth we had were telling us why we couldn't afford those things all those years. And for me, the question then becomes, what is the nature of the growth they're bragging about? And then, and you've kind of alluded to it. I would argue it hasn't been real economic growth. In fact, and we can talk about that more in a minute with manufacturing, we have dismantled the guts of our economy and we've concentrated it in these sectors that are they're not even, they're providing jobs, yeah, but even if you're in the construction sector and you've got a better job, or in the mining sector, you've got a better job, you're also paying through the nose for a house to live in, right? Whereas once upon a time, you had a good job in those sectors and you had an affordable home. So it's the money you're making from your job is being extracted out of you through the banker-dominated financial system, through debt and all the payments you got to keep up. And it's not the economy that it used to be. And in fact, what we're suffering is a real lack of capacity. We are poorer, not richer. Doesn't matter if you've got a flat screen TV. What is our economy capable of, right? We are much poorer. And that's what we've got to wise up to. This is not an improvement, right? This is, we've gone backwards in a big way. Because if the economy cannot provide those things we actually need, then we have to take stock. And the healthcare system is an example of that. And a related example, Martin, is the debate in the pandemic of so-called health versus the economy. There shouldn't be a dichotomy. The economy is what's there to meet our needs, and right now our healthcare is our need, right? There's a healthcare crisis. Well, meet the need, and look how slack governments are at gearing up to meet the healthcare need. We pointed this out. The Doherty modelling for the lockdown lifting treats healthcare as fixed, not a variable. Why isn't it a variable? Why haven't we dropped everything and expanded the crap out of it? Right? No, because whatever KPMG consultants to the governments come up with these brainwaves that governments follow, they don't think that way. And today, just to give you bring it really home, I was talking to an ex-military guy in Brisbane today about China, who shares my concerns about where we're going with China. We changed the subject onto the hospital system because states like Queensland and Western Australia have a health crisis now and they don't have COVID. And he told me he'd spoken to a doctor at Ipswich and asked him how it was going at the Ipswich hospital. And this doctor told him that the other week they had to move someone out of intensive care in the Ipswich hospital because they were full, had to transfer them somewhere else. And the closest ICU unit they could transfer them to from the Ipswich hospital was, get this, Rockhampton. This is Australia's healthcare, the country that beat the world record for economic growth. It's a joke. So there's an example, and we need to look at what our different sectors are doing and address what's gone wrong, and we need policies to do that.
Right, and just to pick up a couple of points there, Robbie. The first one is, how you measure growth is quite important, right?
Yep.
You can fudge it for quite a long time, and Vanessa said earlier on, I put the comment earlier on, a lot of it's to do with government incentives and throwing money about the place, right? Or it's about bringing more migrants into the country just to make the country bigger so that effectively the top line GDP number goes up. But GDP per capita doesn't necessarily. The third one, of course, is that perpetual growth might be impossible anyway. So there's a bunch of reasons why this growth at all costs philosophy is just, making huge issues for us. And then, of course, the question: who benefits from all this activity, all this momentum? And the truth is, and I spoke to Michael Hudson last year on this, and it keeps coming back to me because it's such a critical conversation. What's happened is that all of the wealth floats up to a few, right? And the general population, you and me and everybody else, effectively, is paying through the nose to allow a small proportion of people to get ever richer. Yep. Whether in the mining sector or the finance sector or even the construction sector. But it's not actually flowing into the real economy. It's not providing the benefits that we need to create a better lifestyle and, life support, health, schools, all those things, all the things that we need. So to my mind, the short answer to my question about the economy is for the people, right? The economy is not just there to create wealth for a few rich people. And, the theory is it just cascades from the top and a few crumbs down to the bottom. That whole model, which is the neoliberal view, is what the problem is. Trickle down, yeah.
Yep. Kennedy had a really good, John F. Kennedy, had a really good metaphor for the opposite of trickle down, which was a rising tide lifts all boats. But instead, we've had this trickle down idea. At its heart, Martin, it goes back to just basic stuff like the belief that economics is supply and demand. And when you combine that with the neoliberal ideology, where governments aren't allowed to do anything, then it's all got to be driven by consumption, right? And so that's why you bring in more migrants, not for the reason we brought them in after World War II. Why do we bring them in after World War II? They contributed to the economic development of Australia by actually contributing to it. They helped us build the country, right? Now it's just bring them in, pack them into Melbourne and Sydney. And that's what was happening before the pandemic. And because they're going to consume more of the only things we're willing to make, which is housing and whatever. Whereas we've long advocated the people metric of measuring an economy, which is we call it relative potential population density. If your economy is growing, then you can sustain a higher population density at a higher living standard. And that's not you can't do that if all the money just goes to the top. You're talking about where people are sharing the economic growth. And technology comes, you invest in the technology that allows you to make your life easier, right? And you save labor, you have more hours of leisure and time to think and enjoy culture and all these sort of things. Have family time, and instead of the rat race that the neoliberal economy has engendered, right? And that's what it is. It really is a rat race because people stop. Instead of the economy being measured at a people level, it started being measured in all these other things that, frankly, and they always called it GDP, but it's like you could fake the GDP now, right? The raw figures are there, but they don't tell you the story about what's actually happening until it's too late, and that's why, we got to look at the structure of the economy, right? Why is it not meeting these needs of the people? Even if you take probably the one part of the economy no one argues about, which in terms of its contribution, which is mining, right? Because that's what's left, and then mainly the industrial side of the economy, it's mining, and that certainly makes a contribution. But I don't know if I mentioned on your program before, but I remember reading the biography of former Prime Minister John Gorton, and how in his day there was an effort to invest in manufacturing in Australia so that we weren't just exporting raw materials. Because if you're exporting raw materials and not value adding to them here, you're actually denying yourself real wealth, real national income. And the figures, I've memorized them and I'll never forget them, and I cite them often because it's just mind blowing. The big issue was the aluminium industry then, because we had Weipa, the biggest bauxite mine in the world. 1 million tonnes of bauxite in 1970 earned Australia $5 million. Processed once into alumina, it earned $27 million. Processed again into aluminium, it earned $120 million. And processed finally into aluminium products and earned $600 million. That's the difference between the final product and the raw material. And that was a cabinet paper in 1970 that had those figures. And that government invested in what was set up the Australian Industry Development Corporation to develop industry so that we could start accumulating that wealth here in Australia, right? And that's what we got rid of in the last 30 years. And yeah, it's great. We make, when China's prepared to pay through the nose for iron ore, we're getting a windfall, but we're actually not. In terms of the wealth we could have in Australia, we're not. And so it's things like that. Knowing that, then you re-look at the economy and going, what do we have to do here?
And give you an example, Robbie. We have the rare earths which we mine here in Australia for, the battery industry, right? Yep. What happens is we mine them and then take them to China or somewhere else so they can go and make batteries, and then we go and buy batteries from China, which means that all of that added value is actually not coming to us. We're actually paying a lot more than we should for our batteries because it has to go offshore and back onshore again, right? And that's just a simple example.
The same thing. We send out. We're a lithium producer. Send it out and it comes back. That's one of the battery ones. The value adding part we're missing out of is massive in lithium. Massive.
Yep.
But
So the question then is this a political setting? So in other words, have decisions been taken that we've ended up, or is this a factor because we are effectively exposed to global competitive forces and global wages, and everybody argues, well, it's too expensive now to do things locally, right? It's much cheaper just to sort of throw them overseas and then go buy them cheap, right? Is that what's driving it, or is it an ideological issue, do you think?
Well, it's both, but the ideology was spread globally, Martin. That's the problem. It kind of happened all around the world at once. And, we've documented this in great detail. The short version is 1947, there was a monumental meeting which no one would appreciate. And it was in Switzerland, a place called Mont Pelerin. And that's where these Austrian school economists and some unreconstructed European aristocrats who had been backers of Mussolini and the Bank of England got together. And the Austrian economists were people like Friedrich von Hayek. Milton Friedman was there. And they set up this organization called the Mont Pelerin Society. And what the whole purpose was, they opposed the post-war economic consensus, which Roosevelt had started in the 30s. And by the end of World War II, you had the Chifley government in Australia, you had the Attlee government in the UK. I mean, Clement Attlee nationalised the Bank of England in 1946. This was part of the consensus. They set up the National Health Service, right? The biggest still to this day, the biggest healthcare service in the world is the UK's National Health Service. There was a commitment. I mean, people in those days when welfare wasn't a dirty word, they would just sort of blanket label it the welfare state. But it was really a commitment to saying we've got to make sure the economy serves people, right? No more laissez-faire. And so this meeting in Switzerland was about, no, we serve the elite who benefit from laissez-faire, right? And they worked at it. These were the people that sponsored Thatcher. And so with the rise of Thatcher in the 70s, they'd set all these think tanks up around Australia. Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney is one of them. The IPA in Melbourne was effectively taken over by this group. There's another outfit that came along here a bit later called the Tasman Institute. H.R. Nichols Society was set up with a bent to bash trade unions. And they targeted all the regulations and institutions that got in the way of just unbridled profiteering by corporations, which is what neoliberalism allowed. And suddenly everyone was preaching that gospel. Ronald Reagan, Thatcher, Roger Douglas in New Zealand, Hawke and Keating here in Australia. And this ideology, everyone signed onto it, right? And once it was globally signed onto, then they, these liberal economic doctrines reappeared. Josh Frydenberg to this day keeps referring to it when they talk about manufacturing. There'll be a discussion in the federal government about manufacturing, and Josh Frydenberg says, but we must pursue our comparative advantage. And what comparative advantage means, that the comparative advantage was an invention of the economists of the East India Company. Because the East India Company ruled the world, and they destroyed China's textile. China had a fantastic textile industry. They destroyed that, made the Chinese, not the Chinese, the Indians. The Indians had a textile industry. They made them grow opium. They took the opium to China and made the Chinese give them tea. They took the tea to America. They got slaves from Africa and took them to the Americas to trade for sugar and cotton, and took the cotton back to Manchester so that virtual slave labor could make it into clothes. And that's how they had an economy where every part of it just specialized in one thing, comparative advantage. So in this modern world, New Zealand's contribution is dairy and probably sheep. Ours is whatever, and minerals. China's is manpower. And you can't have functioning nations. You've got to have this globalized system. And it doesn't work. It should never have even been considered, because there's all sorts of questions of sovereignty and whatever involved. But the slightest thing goes wrong and it breaks down, and supply chains are vulnerable and all those sort of things. So that's the lesson this has taught us, but we need to rethink that ideology. And so far, all I've seen is in this context of the pandemic and supposedly learning those lessons, I've seen a lot of lip service paid to it. But certainly this government and people like Frydenberg, they don't want to give up that ideology. So you've got to rethink the ideology, realize what it is, and then go back and going, I don't think you can snap your fingers overnight and get our manufacturing back. But I tell you what, you can have that as an intention over time. But there's some things you can do straight away to encourage innovation and that potential in Australia, which is huge, right? The potential is enormous, and we could really start to make this sector flourish again.
Right, and you're talking about something really important, right? Which is this idea of the global economy and all those things, right? And we've got, of course, things like the World Bank and United Nations and these other global institutions all espousing in various versions the same stuff, which is the same neoliberal stuff that you're talking about, right? But of course, they all come from a particular set of cultures and a particular ideological standpoint, which means that they keep saying all the same things, right? And so that's one of the things that I think people sometimes don't fully understand, just how entrenched this philosophical viewpoint is, at institutions which are supranational as well as actually at a national level.
Yep. Well, and especially in our countries, we've been used to sort of going along with global agendas, but do pay attention to the fact that outside of our countries, outside of the countries that we see, that we perceive, that the media talks about, which tend to be the white English-speaking countries, there's a much bigger world out there. And there's been long-standing ideological battles with those countries and these global institutions. And the big one right now is there's one country that's changing the rules. And the neoliberal ideologists don't really like it because, China embraced free market policies, but only to the extent that they serve China's interests. And it just so happens that we used to treat the free market the same way. Private enterprise is great, but the free market cannot dictate to the national good. And China's success is encouraging other countries around the world to want to do business with China. And so the World Bank has competition now through some of these financial institutions that come from China, or the Asian that China's a part of, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS New Development Bank, etc. There are alternatives now. the economic development of Africa has accelerated enormously in the recent period around kind of the infrastructure investments that China has been prepared to make there. That's allowing those countries to not have to bow to the IMF the way they did. They just automatically had to once upon a time, and all China's doing is they figured out that they had to do something differently, but learn what was good from the rest of the world and put it into practice, but without letting it get out of control, right? And so that's actually that. While that's working, and I think there's good reasons it is working, but while it's working, it is encouraging the rest of the world a lot of the rest of the world to want to do business like that, and that is really changing these institutions, because there was never a case where the UN or the World Bank could really dictate to countries, right? You had to go to them cap in, like with the World Bank or the IMF, you had to go to them cap in hand first, right? Once you did, then that came with conditions, and it was those conditions that allowed them to force through all these economic reforms in those countries, and that dynamic is changing. One of the points that we've always made, Martin, is that the recent success of China, actually look at what it did. It's what we used to do. It's what the United States used to do. It's what Japan, China openly learned from Japan, learned from Singapore, learned from Australia, learned from the United States. It's working. Let's go. That's worked for them. Giving it up hasn't worked for us. Let's go back to doing it again.
Right. And one of the interesting questions, of course, here is the role of finance in the finance sector, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously, if you're going to do new stuff, and if you're going to, build for the future, you have to be able to finance it in a way that makes sense. And it's interesting to me that a lot of the excuses about we can't afford to do this or that or the other, right, is, again, it's an ideological standpoint which probably doesn't really, stand looking at particularly hard, but it's still very much pushed there. But the question then is, the finance sector, does it get in the way? And if it does, how do we solve that?
Pull the pin. It certainly gets in the way, because they want it all their own way. Now, so people who are familiar with the Citizens Party will know that when we talk about national banking, we base it on the ideas that the originator of those ideas was the inaugural US Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, right, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. And in Hamilton's day, when he set up the first bank of the United States and invented essentially this concept of national banking, he was at war with the private banks. And in fact, to this day, JP Morgan in New York displays the pistols that Aaron Burr used to kill Hamilton in a duel. I kid you not, they display them because they're proud of them, because the bank that Burr founded, called the Manhattan Company, eventually evolved into what is now JP Morgan. And this was an ideological thing. And Hamilton tore these guys' throats out, these bankers' throats out, because he made the point, with this bank, this is one of the things he said at the time. He says, the bank that we've created, this national bank, has made our economy so much bigger. Your part of it is bigger. This is what he's saying to private banks. Your share of the economy is bigger than it would have been without this national bank, but you don't have a monopoly. However, you people are so stupid, you would prefer all of a smaller pie, right, that you monopolize, rather than a bigger part of a bigger pie, but you don't have all of it. And that's been the ideological battle for 230 years or so, right? And in fact, yes, Baxter in Brisbane, my kids, especially my son, they're fanatics for the musical Hamilton. Oh, mate, my son's got it half memorized. They made me watch it, and it's pretty good, and it covers some of this stuff really well. But it's sort of a rap musical or whatever. But my son Franklin, I mean, he's just in love with this musical. It's pretty impressive. His story, Hamilton's story, is certainly worth being told. But that influenced policy around the world. And, King O'Malley was the guy who founded the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And in 1905, he gave this profound speech in the Parliament, went for 5 hours, and he said, "I am the Alexander Hamilton of Australia." He was the greatest financial genius to ever walk the earth, and his ideas have never been improved upon. They set up the Commonwealth Bank, and it played an enormous role in the history of Australia. And that was all taken down from the 1980s onwards, right? The Campbell Financial System Inquiry in 1982 explicitly recommended that all public banking institutions in Australia be dismantled. And so since they privatised the Commonwealth Bank in 1996, we haven't had public banking institutions except for two minor exceptions, which is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation that the Greens got Julia Gillard to pass, which is it's very small though. It's $10 billion, but that's to put public money into clean energy in technology. And there is a Rural Finance Initiative, which is also way too small. But they're actually quite recent. So for a long time, there was the private banking monopoly ruled Australia. So then what have they turned us into? I mean, see for yourself. They are not, you'd remember this chart, Wilson, Martin, because Dr. Wilson Sy, the former APRA principal researcher, he did up this brilliant chart a couple of years ago, kind of illustrating the Glass-Steagall effect, but also just the state of the Australian economy. And bank lending to business as opposed to mortgages went like that. So in the early 90s, it was roughly 70% to business, 30% to mortgages. By 2018, when Wilson did the chart, it was literally the opposite: 30% to business, 70% to mortgages. And one of the ironies there, of course, is that the businesses employ the people who borrow the mortgages and need to repay them, right? But banks are not interested in lending to business anymore. And then that has had an enormous flow-on effect. People don't take it seriously enough. Credit unions, Dennis, is not good enough because they tend to just go along with most of what they do with mortgages as well. They could be encouraged to do more, but it's not. You've got to have some government settings to encourage that kind of thing. There's a German economist, Richard Werner, who actually talks about the German model, where Germans' massive industrial capacity, which is with all these small industries, is fueled by all these local German banks, and that would be good. But you've got to have government settings to encourage that. What we've got now doesn't do that, and it starves business of credit, starves small business of credit. You can only borrow if you put your house up, because essentially then they become mortgages. They're not really business loans, right? And I think even the IMF the other day criticised that about Australia, right? And that was quite, the IMF is saying that's a ridiculous model that Australia uses. You saw that?
The OECD as well. Yeah.
The OECD. Yep. Yeah.
Yep.
Because it's terrible that it's so lopsided that's what and why do the banks do it? Because mortgages is maximum profits for them.
Yep.
Right. And the real economy is literally starved of credit.
Well, it's worth making the point, of course, under the Basel rules, or the Basel, depending on which side of the river you come from, the Basel rules, it's about a quarter of the capital for a mortgage relative to a business loan. In other words, if I'm a bank, I can make 4 times the loans on mortgages relative to lending to business, right? Yeah. Now, they argue that's because the risk profiles are different, and that may be true, but the net effect of that is that banks much prefer to lend for mortgages. They're not lending for businesses. In my small business surveys, I get more and more stories of people unable to access credit. They can't take their business forward because they can't get the money. Even if they put their house up, it doesn't always work. And then, of course, the other side of that is that banks also are very, very draconian when it comes to small businesses. So, we know a number of people who've had businesses that basically have just been railroaded by dictatorial behaviour from the banks because they don't really believe in small businesses and working with small businesses, right? And it's just the nature of the beast. So the beast has to change if we're going to actually drive it towards supporting the economy that we discussed earlier on we need, right? So there has to be a different model. And whether that's a credit union model or whether it's a government-backed bank or a combination or whatever, right? But we have to find a different way through this. Remember this, Robbie, I keep saying this, people are effectively turned into a series of cash flows, right? That's how they're valued, right? So banks are happy for you to take a 35, 45, 55 year mortgage because they know that over that 35, 45, 55 years, you're just going to go on paying, right? They can therefore use those cash flows to bolster their own performance and their own profitability. Doesn't help anybody.
No, it's we're the milking cow and they're the dairy, and they just keep milking away. So you've got to break a lot of this. You can trace it back to when the banks got a private monopoly over Australian financial system. So we have to break the private monopoly. It's not communism. Australia was never a communist country, but we had a national bank, Commonwealth Bank, and it did, when it was allowed to do a good job, it did a brilliant job, especially in the World War II period. So let's break the monopoly. You break the monopoly, and what happens is a public bank that, as you and I discussed before, Martin, there's been numerous attempts in the last few years, especially with fintech and all this stuff. These startups have started to challenge the big banks, and they've either failed, or if they've succeeded, a big bank's bought them up, right? And the monopoly stays. And so the only institution under these circumstances that can challenge that monopoly is the Australian government. And if they set up a public bank, so one of our policies is for a postal bank, which can pretty much replicate the way the Commonwealth Bank started, but that's a retail banking alternative to the private banks. And we need a development bank / infrastructure bank, either one institution or two. Get the Reserve Bank much more involved with those, right? Connect them in together. But what can you do? Well, so like a private bank, a postal bank, a retail level alternative to the major banks can be something that just competes on service. How? By providing one.
Novel idea.
Not rocket science, right? Yeah. Turn every post office into a bank. Your deposits are guaranteed because it's the government who owns the bank, right? The government's not going to go broke. You can make sure that it's committed to maintaining the cash payment system. You can provide. You can put a lot of emphasis on the local area for lending and all those sort of needs. Make sure that's taken care of. Revive financial services infrastructure in the regions, etc. That's what that kind of bank can do. It would absolutely flourish. The legislation that we've drafted for a postal bank, we have an interesting part in there where. Sorry, I keep getting distracted by these comments. Yes, Vanessa, Australia Post can barely deliver your mail, but as you know, Australia Post has been sabotaged in recent years. So this is premised upon that all being reformed as well, right? If the Australia Post could go back to delivering the mail if the government wasn't committed to sabotaging it. So the same government that would be prepared to start a postal bank would be prepared to stop sabotaging Australia Post. I doubt if we'll get Christine Holgate back, but you never know. A big enough offer, we might be able to. But the interesting part in our bill, Martin, is that because a banker explained it to me that one of the difficulties in starting up one of these new financial institutions in Australia is how does it make enough loans to multiply the deposits enough to actually cover the costs, etc. Now, I think he was being a bit pessimistic, but certainly what you can do is take surplus deposits and invest them in another government bank, which is a development bank. And when you have a development bank, I tell you what, this is where banking and business, small business, farming, industry can fit like a glove, because one of the things that business needs is that a guy working 9 to 5 who's just borrowed money to pay a mortgage doesn't need as much is flexibility, right? Because business, especially businesses like farming, can fluctuate. And one of the people that I've been in dialogue with this is a lecturer at the Queensland University of Technology, Mark McGovern. I'll give you a call out, Mark, if you're watching. Mark's made a few submissions to some of these inquiries we've encouraged people to make submissions to, but he's quite an expert in this area, and he points out that you can have, just take farming, right? A development bank that's there to lend to farming. It can be flexible in loan repayments. It can be flexible in interest repayments, because some say the Western Australia wheat belt is going through a hard time and the farmers there are in great difficulty. There might be a drought or something. What the private banks do under those circumstances is mass foreclose, and it's carnage in the wheat belt. It happened back in 2012. It was ridiculous. It made Rod Cullen a political figure, what the banks did in the wheat belt in Western Australia, because he was one of the places that the farmers that got foreclosed on. This was before the Royal Commission, when the government banned it, or the Royal Commission recommended they ban it. The banks would whack the farmers with penalty interest rates. So they already can't pay their debt. Suddenly they've got to pay 20% interest. This was just bastardry. A development bank, a national development bank like the old Commonwealth Development Bank could say, well, yeah, the WA wheat belt guys are having a bad time. The Queensland sugar growers are having a bumper crop, right? And so they're making their payments. They're covered. There's money coming in from them that is keeping the coffers full. That can help us be flexible with the WA wheat guys, right? You can give them loan holidays and all those sort of things. You see them through, because once they come through the other side, of course they'll be profitable. But I tell you what that does, it keeps family farmers on the land, that kind of approach, instead of foreclosing so corporate agribusiness can take over, right? And that kind of flexibility can be applied at a local level with business, some industry guy. There's lots of, I've told you this in the past. My great mate down here in Melbourne, who's an engineer, Paul Jindra, he keeps telling me what fantastic the potential there is among engineering businesses in Australia. These guys that work with machinery in their own workshops, and he says they know nothing about money, but they're driven by an idea, right? And if they got some backing to employ a few people to bring their idea to market, he said some will fail, some will succeed. A handful have become bigger than BHP, right? But no one in Australia backs them, right? And certainly not the private banks. So that's what public banking institutions have the flexibility to do. Now, you want to make sure they're properly staffed by professionals, people who know both finance and industry. That's very important. Public banks in the past, can be something like a brains trust of real capacity that's there to help make the right judgments, etc. It's not about just throwing money around like confetti, but you provide backing to the potential, and the stuff that comes off spectacularly. It's not rocket science. These are the ways we can turn the economy around.
Yes. Well, as with all of these things, it's about political intent and policy decisions, right? Because you can decide to do X or you can decide to do Y, but The point is that they always choose one rather than the other, and the one that is, as we said earlier on, neoliberal based and isn't actually working. So the point is there are alternative policy settings that could make a huge difference. The other angle though, Robbie, is the regulation and the regulators and the role that they play, right? Because we have the Reserve Bank, we have APRA, we have ASIC. I would argue that none of them are actually doing the job they should be doing, which is effectively, being a strong cop on the beat, protecting the interests of real businesses, real households, and all of that, right? They are all playing the same neoliberal game, which basically means stacking the decks for the big end of town. Term funding facility, great example. Somebody asked earlier on, what effect did the term funding facility had? The answer is it boosted the bank's profits.
Yep.
CBA, for example, is buying back a proportion of its shares, and about 4 basis points of its profits came directly from the term funding facility. How stupid?
Wow.
How stupid is that, given the total amount of money that was thrown all over the place last year, right?
And we can't get these banks to pay their victims.
No, exactly right. So let's just think about the regulatory framework a little bit, right? Because we've got a new incumbent in ASIC,
Yep.
I would argue the previous incumbent was actually upsetting the government, and so they sort of kicked him out and brought a friendly in. And now basically ASIC is being told by Frydenberg that your main role is to help the growth of the economy. Nothing about being the cop on the beat. I mean, how does that work?
Oh, exactly. In 2019, Wilson Tsai wrote this, and Wilson had worked at both APRA and ASIC. He wrote this great paper that you can look it up, The Farce of Fake Regulation. And his point was, we have regulation in Australia, it's just fake. It's there for appearances only because the assumption is neoliberal, that there shouldn't be regulation. But of course, you know, the people that's what the politicians believe. The public expect that cop on the beat is a real person, not a cardboard cutout. Right? They're assuming there's a cop on the beat, and the bankers don't want a cop on the beat, right? So they've got to have one in name only. Now the Royal Commission was a rude shock to that model, but the public assumed that would mean change. The politicians never intended for it to mean change. And if you saw our release the other day where we talked about Commissioner Kenneth Hayne must have been able to see the future, Martin, because that look in Kenneth Hayne's eye, you look at that photo again of Kenneth Hayne handing over the Royal Commission report to Josh Frydenberg.
Yeah.
And if you saw the video, he wouldn't shake Frydenberg's hand. He just didn't want to pose for the camera, but he's looking at, and we said he saw the future because he knew this little faker was just paying lip service to the Royal Commission and fully intended to trash the whole lot. And 2.5 years later, he has. Now, James Shipton, yes, had been a problem because Shipton had been appointed head ASIC the same at the beginning of the month of November 2017, early in the month. And it was at the end of the month that there was this almighty rebellion in the parliament that forced the Royal Commission to be called. And I had been talking to parliamentarians who had predicted to me, oh, looks like we're going to have a Royal Commission. But one of them said Morrison would already have the terms of reference in his back pocket to go with if he's pushed. And he was pushed, and he whipped out the terms of reference, and it was terms of reference the banks had approved of, but we got the Royal Commission. Now, the Royal Commission, in terms of what it exposed, did a lot of good work, and there were plenty of good recommendations there. But for Shipton, who had already been appointed the head of ASIC, you know, and he'd been based in Hong Kong, and he's sort of a bit of an unknown entity in Australia to a degree. He spent his first 12 months in the job watching his agency, you know, lashed every day at the Royal Commission, and there's no doubt he ended that experience determined to lift ASIC's game, and that's what he did. And of all the things that we've talked about, he did the most concrete metric was this question of enforceable undertakings, because these were the pathetic, you know, traffic fines that ASIC had been hitting the banks with instead of actual prosecutions, right? The effective just slaps on the wrist, the equivalent of a parking ticket. There'd been something like 45 of those in 2017, 45, 50, whatever, or 2018. In 2020, there was zero. And instead, they stepped up enforcement, right? Daniel Crennan, who was the head of enforcement, Shipton's deputy, said the banks should fear us. That was a headline in the Financial Review that day. And you can imagine what the banks thought of that. No way, no how. You know, it just blew my mind how it's almost like it's coordinated. The same day Christine Holgate got smashed in Parliament over the watches, October 23 last year, we're coming up to the anniversary. That same day, the Auditor General wrote a letter, which would have been pre-organised. It's just the formality. That's the same day he wrote a letter to Frydenberg. The next day, Frydenberg responded to about this supposed expenses scandal involving Shipton and Long and Crennan. And next thing you know, they're out of there. And who are they replaced by? Well, the first bit of suspicion we had was that the Fin Review called Joe Longo, Shipton's replacement, the business-friendly regulator that Frydenberg craves. That's how the Fin Review describes him. We've just had an article in our publication, just Just hang on a second, Martin. Is that online? Oh, okay. It's on. I was just checking the Brains Trust over here. It's online, so you can go to our website. It's called Josh Frydenberg's White Collar Defender, and it's an article about Joe Longo, because what the author Melissa Harrison did is she dug back through articles going back 30 years. Joe Longo is a poacher turned gamekeeper twice. And it's not just it's happened twice, it's the circumstance in which it's happened. So back in the day, Joe Longo was Alan Bond's lawyer. And he was crying foul that at ASIC's prosecution of Alan Bond. And, you know, back in the 90s, people might remember those days. There was a lot of attention on Alan Bond and Christopher Skase, and they deserved to be because they had cost a lot of people a lot of money. But there was a lot of attention on them, and they really were pursued. And I remember the way they pursued Skase over there in Mallorca. But this was a big deal. Joe Longo said he complained there had been an overreaction to white collar crime. Right? What does he do? He ends up going and working for ASIC and joins ASIC's enforcement. He becomes head of ASIC's enforcement. What happens to ASIC's enforcement under Joe Longo back in the late 90s and early 2000s? It became toothless. In the year 2000, Adele Ferguson wrote an article just how weak ASIC had become under Joe Longo as the enforcer, right? He defanged ASIC in those years, deliberately defanged ASIC. So voila, 20 years later, here's Shipton and Crennan ramping up enforcement, upsetting the Treasurer, who has no intention of changing the fakeness of regulation in Australia post the Royal Commission, just intends to trash it. Who does he bring back? The same Joe Longo. And now Joe Longo made it clear in the Fin Review the other week that enforceable undertakings are back. He said that this famous phrase that the Royal Commissioner Kenneth Hayne had said to ASIC, "Why not litigate?" He and Sarah Court said, the new deputy said, "Oh, why not litigate has had its day." What, 2 years? 2 years of why not litigate has had its day, right? It's all over. The intention of a proper financial system or a properly accountable financial system post the Royal Commission, it's all gone. And what happens is, people who follow our campaigns might know we've been talking about some bank victim cases again, or financial victims in general. And there's this case in Western Australia with these elderly people in the Sterling First scandal. And these were people that they've ruined, their lives are ruined. It wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme they got into. It was just a practical way to downsize their homes and prepay the rent for the rest of their life. They did not think they were investors. They were just prepaying rent for the rest of their life. For 40 years or the rest of their life, whatever comes sooner, you know, for all of them would have been the rest of their life. And the whole thing was a scam. Now, that involves the banks on the periphery. They certainly had a hand in that, but they're not the main driver. This is just the people running this particular thing were just, you know, financial Ponzi merchants, you know, going way back with wreckage in their wake. But ASIC knew their track record, but didn't warn these elderly people, didn't provide them the basic information, which is ASIC's job. Its job is to inform the consumer. That's what the legislation says. It didn't inform these people that they were signing up with guys who had a string of financial wreckages in their wake. And so the lesson there is, because Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison, to protect the banks, keep the regulator weak, it can't even do its basic job in the rest of the financial system. It's weak across the board. I don't think Josh Frydenberg or Morrison have any reason to protect these Sterling First directors. They probably wouldn't even know who they are. Maybe they do. I doubt it. It's just that they want a weak regulatory system to protect the banks. Nothing gets in the way of the banks having unbridled profits, right? And that puts the rest of us at risk. And it's that kind of risk that, you know, most of us aren't going to think about because we think it won't happen to us. When it does happen to us, it destroys our lives, but it's always it's a small percentage of the public. But it's big enough that, you know, you can get a Royal Commission out of it every now and then. And I interviewed another victim on our show, Wayne Ditchburn from down to Ulladulla there on the south coast. and listen to his story, what he went through in his fight for the banks. There's thousands of these bank victims out there, but there's not 20 million Wayne Ditchburns. There's tens of thousands of them. There's enough of them that you can find them if you're looking for, but you don't have to be confronted with it every day. So you can forget about that it's actually happening, but if it happens to you, you'll know about it, because these banks destroy your life if you're unlucky enough to get involved in something that they want to exploit. They'll destroy your life and they'll get away with it. And then you'll realize how important this issue of financial regulation actually is. And so we really do have to clean that up. And what we're trying very hard to do is get a Senate inquiry up. As you know, Martin, the makeup of this Senate right now is quite interesting. There's enough goodwill and honesty in there on this question of the financial system that even though people might think we have inquiry fatigue, we were pretty happy with how the Australia Post inquiry was handled by this Senate. If we can get a Senate inquiry into ASIC and the financial system and the government's response to the Royal Commission, and the senators get to write their own terms of reference, and that's really key, not a terms of reference the banks approve, their own terms of reference, we can open the book quite fundamentally and really make some of what Josh Frydenberg's done recently blow up in his face.
Absolutely. Well, we'll watch that with interest. There's definitely, we know that people power can make a difference, right?
Sure.
We've already shown that a few times on cash bans and things. So another good example. And just before we move on to the next conversation, I want to just touch on responsible lending, right? Because one of the things that was brought in after the global financial crisis was obligations. This is ASIC brought it in, obligations on banks to make sure that the loans were not unsuitable, right? And they've been in for a number of years. Of course, the government tried to remove them earlier on this year, and again, it was blocked in the Senate, right? But this is another example. If in fact those responsible lending obligations are taken away, once again, people will be completely exposed to whatever the banks choose to do, because they will have no protection at all. And this is another example, to my mind, of weakened regulation that just doesn't support the interests of businesses and households, right? But again, this is another touchstone, another example of the trajectory that we're seeing from the Treasury and from the Treasurer, right? And effectively, it's all designed to bolster the interests of those big financial institutions and protect their interests, never mind the real Australians, the real businesses. And that's why we have to find a different model if we're going to actually, to where we came into this conversation, build our economy differently. Yeah,
they claim that they need to do it to. It really took the cake for me when they said, "Oh, we've got to change these laws so we can because we can't lend to business." You weren't lending to business anyway. That's the problem. That's what's wrong with our economy. These banks are not going to lend more to business if we change responsible lending laws. They've got no interest in doing that. They're good at coming up with the excuses that sound plausible, but they've already got their property bubble back. It's going gangbusters everywhere. I mean, we're heading for it, like we're just adding up to the debt pile for the inevitable avalanche that's going to come crashing down on us one day. But the markets are roaring, and that's really all the banks are interested in. There may be a question of volume. The last time I had a briefing from an expert, I think it was Edwin Almeida, gave me a briefing from the Sydney real estate market, and volume potentially was an issue.
Yep.
So that the banks might be concerned in that area, but in general, what are the actual constraints on their lending? And James Shipton really made himself unpopular with the government when he said there's no economic reason. The excuse the government says, we need to improve the economy. He said there's no economic reason to water down responsible lending laws. It's just, this is anything that smacks of effective regulation in this country, the government is determined to dismantle.
Absolutely. Well, that's why we need a different mode of engagement and a different model for the economy. And by the way, a more strategic view, that's the other thing that I always come back to. A lot of the stuff that's done is just election cycle to election cycle, right? It's about how do I get re-elected? And obviously, if you aren't in power, you can't do anything. But on the other hand, if all you're doing is plotting to get re-elected next time, then nothing really changes. And I also make the point, Robbie, that both sides of politics, both the main parties, are as culpable as each other with this, right? So this isn't like, neoliberalism sits within, the Conservative part, but, Labour and Conservative and the Nationals, they've all got this same underlying doctrine that's driving what they're doing. And that's the problem.
It's a huge problem. And it's at federal and state levels. There's ideology, then there's just the way bureaucracy is structured now. You've got so much of the actual influence and ideas level of government is provided through these consulting firms, because we've gutted the public service. We don't have expertise in the public service anymore. And who are the consulting firms? There's the same 6 firms for the whole world.
Yes.
Right?
And they charge an arm and a leg.
Boston and what's the other one? McKinsey, right? And they're running government for literally the whole world.
Yep.
You want to see an example? Look at the contracts these consultants to have to deal with the pandemic. Boston Consulting was I think it was Boston Consulting or KPMG, one of those, was involved in the vaccine rollout, or one of what's that got to do with Boston Consulting, for crying out loud? Why don't we have expertise in the public service that's deep, that represents a range of experience over time, etc.? Why don't we have that anymore? So you got that problem where the public service that's supposed to be fearless and frank in its advice is hollowed out and gutted in many ways. And then you got the ideology of the politicians, and let me tell you something, these consulting firms are very ideological. Yep. Because they are products of the neoliberal world, right? That's why they're so big. That's what, so you'll never get a change of direction from them. So we do have to, the public has to ram through the change here ideologically, Mark, in the sense that we've got to demand that the governments, change their outlook or die politically, and support the political leaders that deliver on that. We highlighted on our show a little while ago, I couldn't believe it, about a month ago, the news broke that the company in Shepparton in Victoria here called Medcon, which was the only mask manufacturer in Australia at the start of last year, the only one.
Yep.
And when there was a sense that we needed PPE, the government turned to this company up the road was Puckapunyal. They brought in the army. They ramped up production of this company. There were 2 machines. They reverse engineered them to make 10 machines, and they went from 2 million masks to 60 million masks in 1 year. They went to 150 permanent staff in that company. Right, bang! They just expanded the capacity to the hilt. That was last year. Medcon's back to 2 machines and 25 staff. Why? Because the public health agencies around Australia are back to getting their PPE from overseas.
Yep.
This government had said we need manufacturing in Australia. It's all lip service, right? They in a real bind they did it, but they've got no ongoing commitment to it. And we, the people, have to demand that changes. We have to know that sort of thing is serious. Those are the things upon which our economic future depend, right? That's the long-term stuff that we've got to identify. These are the cracks in the damn wall that's going to bring it all down on our head. If we don't change that, we have to demand politicians. We have to give them the message that we want them to make long-term decisions.
Yep.
Because if we vote for them on short-term considerations, like, can I get political? I'm a political party, so well, you'll forgive me. If anyone votes for that charlatan Clive Palmer after what he's done the last 2 times to show he's a charlatan, but because right now you think vax is the issue, so you'll vote for a guy that's a charlatan just because he's putting all that money into it, you're the one who's making politicians short term. Sorry, there's my editorial statement. If we make our votes based on short-term considerations like that, where we'll even vote for a charlatan because he's saying what we want to hear, right? Rather than who's really going to make the country a better place, then we're not helping. We're keeping the system short term.
Right.
I better not look at the comments after that.
No, we'll push them to one side. But look, the point is, Robbie, the point is that individuals have an opportunity, right, to ask the right questions of our politicians and those who would like to be our politicians, right? And some of the things we've been touching on, like, so what is the purpose of the economy, and what are you going to do in terms of rebuilding the long term? Those are the sorts of questions that we need to force them to engage with. And my own perspective is the media in Australia pretty much never ask those questions, right?
No, they don't.
They just recycle the short-term little stories, the little, character profiles and those sorts of things. There's no real strategic debate in Australia on these fundamental issues that we've been touching for the last hour plus. And I think that's a disgrace.
Yeah, and so let's not play their game. I mean, the media is going to do what the media is going to do, and every now and then something will happen where it sounds like they're forced to look at something important. But most of the time, they're going to do what you say. But there is an established alternative media now, like in terms of the medium itself, like we're on right now, gets pretty crazy. So you've got to sort of be discerning of what you choose to view in. But I can, without blowing our own trumpet, Martin, I dare say that of all the things people could be watching on YouTube tonight, this is probably one of the more sensible discussions, and people can tune in and see that. You can go somewhere else for a lot more colour, but it's not necessarily going to be that profound in terms of its contribution. Let's make sure that those things get supported, and that gets reflected back to the politicians, whether the other media does or not, and they'll respond to it. One of the things that we've done successfully through our shows is draw the public into engaging with the system at a very serious level, including through these parliamentary inquiries. They're there to be participated in, and we've had great success in terms of, varying degrees of success, but everything we've done has had the success of drawing attention to the subject, right? Just on the manufacturing question, there's this manufacturing inquiry underway right now. And my favourite politician in the world, Kimberley Kitching from the Labor Party, moved it. And if anyone followed the Australia Post inquiry, they would know why I'm smiling when I call her my favourite politician. But for some reason, she moved this inquiry into manufacturing, and it's actually it's got quite a good deal of engagement, but mainly because our organisation participated, and we put out the word and say, make submissions. And this is a really good example of things that are happening in the real economy that the media is not paying attention to, but the public needs to know. We put out the call for people to participate in this inquiry, and I got this extraordinary response from retired TAFE college teachers in New South Wales. And these are one gentleman named Alan Baker, and then he kept, Alan was extraordinary. He kept introducing me over the phone to a lot of his friends he worked with. And they contacted us with one message, that if you want to restore manufacturing in Australia, you have a real problem. And the problem is, it's not just a case of the machines and the factories and whatever. We have a real problem with the skilled workforce, because we don't have it anymore. And worse, we don't have the skills training anymore, because once upon a time that was an uninterrupted supply of skilled labour came through. You had factories with apprentices, etc., but you had the TAFE college system with really skilled people to hone the skills of the skilled labour, and it was a huge infrastructure right across the country, right? Keating and Hawke did the tariff reductions, etc., that started outsourcing all our factories overseas. That gutted the manufacturing itself. And then Howard came along and made the TAFE colleges have to be half self-funding. And suddenly, a machining apprentice has to pay through the nose for his own course, and they stopped doing it. And 25 years later, there's huge consequences. We do not have the capacity to train if we want to expand manufacturing in Australia, if if these politicians get their damn war, when we'll have a bigger supply chain problem than we have now with COVID, and we have to manufacture to save our life, we won't be able to. This is as scary a problem as the fact we've only got 20 days fuel supply in this country, which is a crazy enough problem that we get by with when everything goes perfectly, but when it goes pear-shaped, that's a huge risk. This is a huge risk. These are the serious risks in our economy, and nobody knows about it. And when this guy, Alan Baker, called me, got in touch with me, he sent me an email. He said, I really need to tell you about this problem. He said, you need to call me now because I've got a terminal illness. I don't know how long I'm going to live. And that really got my attention. I thought I better call this guy now. And Alan, he laid all this out to me. He made a submission to the manufacturing inquiry. He contacted all his friends. He contacted ex-students who are running machining, engineering businesses in Australia. These are people that work with the most expensive, sophisticated machinery you could possibly think of, with tolerances and fine settings that can. He explained to me, we've got machines in Australia that could slice a human hair lengthwise 50 times. Those machines must be operated by highly skilled people. You don't have an option. You've got to go through a lot of training before you can operate that kind of machine, right? And these are the guys who used to provide that kind of training. And that's all gone. And so his ex-students who are running these machines, they will rather give up a machine in their business than give up a labourer, give up a worker, because the worker is more valuable. And you cannot replace the worker. You could put the machine out to, just put the machine on furlough for a while or sell it or whatever, right? But the worker is more valuable. And all that we need in Australia, we assume, will just come from overseas, right? And it's crazy. The vulnerability, the entrenched vulnerability in our economy is crazy. That's what we need to make sure demand politicians focus on.
Yep.
These engineering guys running these businesses have gone to their local politicians to try and explain to them just how dire the situation is, and the local politician doesn't get it. They just don't get it. And so, we've got to get the word out there and get people to realise there's all the things you could focus on. Some things are more fundamental than others, and we've got to draw a lot more attention to those fundamental things and force the system to look at it.
Yeah, I'll give you an example, Robbie. In the UK at the moment, they've got issues with the supply of gas, or the cost of gas, so that effectively two plants that actually manufacture fertilizers can't afford to manufacture because it's too expensive, right? As a result of that, they're now not manufacturing CO2, and this CO2 is required, for example, it's used in stun guns in abattoirs, it's used in food preparation, and so there's a cascading
knock-on effect.
Effects, right? And the point is, nobody understands how all these things hang together, right? Until something goes wrong. And that's the problem, that we don't have enough understanding of the risks in the system, right? Until it's too late, and then of course, you react and try and deal with it. But
everything became this one guy. There was this one guy that's been running our economy all these years and fixing everything. His name was Justin Time. Justin Time did everything. He was a Superman, the Superman of the economy, Justin Time. Exactly. Well, Justin got COVID. He's in intensive care, and we're stuffed.
Well, I assume Just in Time is related to She'll Be Right.
Absolutely. And there's consequences for that.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we've got 15 minutes to go, Robbie.
Sure.
I think we should probably drift our conversation towards the China axis, right? And there's a couple of issues that we sort of probably should come to. The first is, I think, let's talk about the subs and the nuclear. And in fact, earlier on, Electro Fried put up a super chat. So we're staring down the barrel of recession. Depression in China goes through a period of economic slowdown, and imagine our largest trading partner reducing demand, not just on will hurt. And earlier on, Master Singleton asked, what's your view of the crash of iron ore price in correlation to the Evergrande bond and stock effect on the Australian economy. So we've got those issues in the background, and then we've got the issue with regards to the subs. And thank you very much to Master Singleton and to Electro Fried for the super chats. So where do we start the conversation? Should we pick up the sub bit first and go from there?
I might not calm down after that, mate. I think the iron ore price is we can touch on that briefly.
Yeah.
And I don't claim to be an expert, but I do know that Australia has enjoyed a real windfall with this iron ore price, and China we have this one-sided press in Australia, and all it's all I saw that, Cookie Boy. Turn the volume down. Stop distracting me with these comments. Anyway, I'll try and stay calm. It's all about economic coercion from China. We might be about to experience economic coercion from France, actually, and it'd be interesting how that gets reported, but we'll put that aside. China has actually been, when it comes to these important trade areas, China's been very forgiving for a long, long time. They accept the price they're given, and they pay it. And even though it's gone, what did it soar to, $280 or something, the iron ore price? I mean, we really did have a windfall. That was never going to last. And separate to those domestic economic developments, like around things like the property market in general and construction, and then whatever Evergrande might have an impact on, China was already committed to getting those prices down, right? Not undercutting Australia, but these were windfall prices. And, they had this side project in Guinea to bring online this massive iron ore, Simeon, or I forget what it's called, this massive iron ore project in Guinea. Well, now the Americans have just backed a coup in Guinea, and I suspect that has strategic implications. We'll see long term. I mean, China will likely try and adapt to that. Maybe that's just pure act of sabotage, but nevertheless, China has lost a lot of its sense of goodwill to Australia, and it wanted to start getting these prices down anyway. So I know there's a list of things that the Chinese have done to reduce speculation in commodities and all those kind of areas. So that's just a general point I'll make about that. There's a general intention, but we make money out of iron ore. $280 is a windfall, but I think for a long time it was like 140, and we'll always make some money out of iron ore if China's buying it off us. The Evergrande question, though, Martin, and again, I'm not an expert, but I do know this. As I was arguing with John Adams today, there's been an industry for 20 years predicting the imminent collapse of China. And the biggest lunatic on earth is an American named Gordon Chang, who shows up on Fox News all the time, the author of The Coming Collapse of China, except he wrote that book in the year 2000, The Coming Collapse of China, and he still shows up in 2021, author of The Coming Collapse of China. I mean, what they don't understand about China is that China doesn't treat the market like Western politicians and Western businessmen treat the market. So with Evergrande, China knew there was a property bubble. They're not in denial there's a property bubble like our governments are. They knew it was an unhealthy property bubble. And in the last few years, they've done they've done numerous things to take the heat, to try and cool it down. While our governments have been opening up the floodgates and the Reserve Bank, et cetera, to pump ours up, China says, this is a problem. We don't like this problem. We're going to try and cool it down. They didn't do that without knowing there would be consequences. Of course, they knew there would be consequences. So now you've got, so whatever Evergrande does, the other thing that's going to be different in China is how China reacts to the crisis. The Chinese government is not going to react to Evergrande the way the American government reacted to Lehman Brothers. Right? They just don't respect the free market enough to say, oh, this is, we're just going to try and maintain this illusion of a free market. If they think they have to step in and do something, they'll have to step in and do something. I did notice that it looks like they might make the foreign creditors take a haircut, 75% haircut.
Yep.
And the domestic creditors, but it's not a simple distinction between domestic and foreign. The domestic creditors who won't get a haircut or will get a smaller haircut, the difference between them and the foreign creditors is they're retail creditors, and the foreign creditors are wholesale creditors. So BlackRock, PIMCO, they're going to take a haircut. They'll probably have to take a haircut, right? Well, they're what you call sophisticated investors, and the Chinese government has distinguished between them for sophisticated investors and retail investors, and I think that's a good distinction. I predict Western media will scream about that, but I think that's a good distinction. So they're going to do that. That's in terms of handling Evergrande itself, things like that. But the broader economic implications, they will just respond to in whatever way they're going to respond to it. I don't know what they're going to do. I'm not saying it's going to work. What I would say is, if you're trying to analyze this, don't assume that the decision-making in China is going to be like the decision-making that you could assume the Reserve Bank might do here, or the American authorities or the British authorities. It wouldn't be the same at all. No,
absolutely. Well, that longer-term, different set of objectives, a levelling up that they really are trying to do, and also a recognition within China that the property market has probably gone way too high.
Yep.
In fact, I did a show earlier on today where I talked about some of the metrics around the property market in China, and in fact, Karen Malley at the AFR did quite an interesting article going through it and talking about it, right? And at the end, I said of my show, actually, what she said about China, you could say about Australia as well, because we're in precisely the same situation, over leveraged, etc., right? So it's not like it's completely, unique. Now, Jason asked a question: what would happen if both China and USA sort of moved towards collapse in the same time? Is that feasible, possible? Who knows? And thanks for the super chat, Jason. It's greatly appreciated. But there are cracks.
A war, it might.
Yeah, well, there are cracks appearing, of course, but the ideological standpoint, they are quite different, and therefore potentially the routes they might take and the levers they might pull could be quite different.
That is definitely what's different. And remember, you can be a purist and criticize that China doesn't have democratic elections or whatever, but they have longevity in their government and their decision making. They don't have the short-term pressures that the Americans have, and that's another reason it's different. There's a fundamental difference. The one big difference between China's huge property bubble and every other country's huge property bubble is China's property bubble as a percentage of its economy is much smaller. So it's big in its own terms, it's enormous, but it's not the main game in China's economy. Ours is the main game in our economy. That's the difference. And so China has an enormously productive economy. It's a productive powerhouse. That's the bread and butter of its economy, that level of production. Yeah, the construction absorbs a lot of materials like iron ore and cement and all that sort of stuff, but they've got a lot more things going on. And they do, we pulled out a Belt and Road. The rest of the world didn't. The rest of the world's going on is well and truly involved in Belt and Road. Belt and Road's roaring ahead. The G7, you can have it, if you remind yourself of the G7 picture from England a few months ago, and they sat around there, the table, the G7 countries, and they're talking about how do we compete with China's Belt and Road. And first you got to remind yourself there's about 200 countries in the world, and this was 7 of them. And there's only one Asian one there, Japan, right? The rest of it, the makeup of the G7 is in many respects a bit of a joke. And already one of them is not interested in participating with them anymore, France, right? Because of what's been done to that. And so there's no way there's a competitor to the Belt and Road. Mm-hmm. Those projects are going ahead. They're going to consume a lot of productive capacity, right? And that's happening. Well, don't look at the world through the Anglo-sphere lens, people. That's happening. That's the real story in the world. We are a white pimple on the world nowadays, and we've reduced ourselves to that. And you know what happens to white pimples?
They get popped.
They get popped.
Yeah, and it's interesting if you look at the proportion of the world population that is actually living under a liberal democracy banner, right? It's about 27%.
Yep. And then if you look at how each of those democracies function, you might even come up with a new definition of democracy.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. Well, as we said earlier on, there's a certain orientation and bias to the way things are done, so that effectively
exactly. Profit
goes to the few, and etc. Now, okay, nuclear subs, Robbie. When you heard the announcement, right? Under wraps, ta-da, last week. I imagine your reaction was quite interesting.
My heart sunk faster than our diesel subs. Look, it's just, the world doesn't have to be like this. There's no reason to. I wish I had the quote handy. June 2019, an Australian said, "We welcome the Belt and Road in the Asia Pacific because of the contribution it's going to make." And that person in June 2019, was Scott Morrison.
Yep.
And since then, he has signed on. I mean, Mike Pompeo was a certifiable lunatic. Mike Pompeo is a wannabe war criminal who wishes he could occupy the same level of hell that Henry Kissinger is going to be in. He tried to do everything he could in his power to start World War III while he was Trump's Secretary of State. And that's what Australia signed on to. And we just adopted this idea that we, not even all the white countries of the world, we will tell our whole neighbours in this region, we are hostile to you. Now, it's mainly China, but they all get the message. We are hostile to you, and we are going to escalate strategically in our region with our great and powerful friends that they copied Menzies saying, the United States and the United Kingdom. The people that Malcolm Fraser called dangerous allies in his book in 2014. Now, why did Malcolm Fraser call them dangerous allies? Malcolm Fraser, Paul Keating, who's been speaking up, and I've been bagging Paul Keating early in this, but on foreign policy, Paul Keating said Australia for too long looked for security from Asia instead of looked for its security in Asia. And that started changing. There was a commitment to a more independent foreign policy from the 1970s onwards. And in fact, bear with me, Martin, but this is going to be this is a quote that's going to be in our publication tomorrow. In 1971, let me quote this: 21st of July, 1971. This is a Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia's DFAT policy planning paper, QP 1171. It was declassified not that long ago. So in 1971, DFAT paper said this. It argued there was, quote, cause for concern whether our alliance with the United States can protect us at every step from political disadvantage resulting from the manner in which the United States conducts its global policies. The American alliance in a changing power balance will mean less to us than it has in the past. If anything, this argument has been strengthened by recent United States actions and America's failure to consult us on issues of primary importance to Australia. Accordingly, we shall need now, more than ever, to formulate independent policies based on Australian national interests and those of our near neighbours that will enable us to react quickly to developments in United States policy towards China and Indochina. And that's what our Department of Foreign Affairs wrote in a policy planning paper in 1971. That was under the McMahon government, I believe, a Liberal government, right? And then most people of a certain age will remember what Whitlam was like and trying to forge this. Malcolm Fraser was part of that. That generation wanted to become more independent. That's all gone. I'm in discussion. That quote is written in an article by Australia's former Deputy Ambassador to Beijing in the 70s and former Ambassador to Iran in the 80s, named John Lander. I'm in discussion with people like him and people of his generation who were involved in foreign policy in Australia, who just looked at the world completely differently. that level of self-respect, that level of confidence in our region, that's all gone. And we've bought into this line, which is us Australians saying that we buy into the idea of Pax Americana. And Pax Americana is the idea of an American empire, which we call more rightly is really an Anglo-American empire. If you know the play Othello, Shakespeare's Othello, you got this kind of like the Anglo-American relationship is like Othello and Iago, where America's Othello, the big dumb brute, and Iago Britain is Iago, the sort of the more manipulative one, but the more experienced in ways of empire. But in 1992, Paul Wolfowitz actually enunciated it. It was called the Defense Policy Guidance. He said, from now on, American foreign policy must be geared to preclude the rise of any rival military or economic power. In other words, there will only ever be one sole superpower. Our foreign policy is geared at making sure there's only one superpower in the world, right? So through self-inflicted policies, America destroyed itself, bankrupted itself fighting wars, gave Wall Street speculators the run of its economy, and literally destroyed itself. China got on with building up its economy and just worked at it and didn't fight wars and those sort of things. And China has risen, America has decayed, and now in the last 5 years or so, America's just been completely alarmed. Oh, we're about to be eclipsed. That means we must go to war. No, it doesn't. You don't have to. You can accept a multipolar world. You can accept the world's changed, but only if you're not a lunatic. Only if you would accept it if you're not a lunatic. If you're going to be committed to this lunatic idea of a unipolar world and you can't back it up, except in one area where you exceed the world many times over, which is military spending, then you're going to go to war, right? And we, instead of being what does a good friend do to a friend who's a lunatic? Slap them in the face and give them some advice. A bad friend kisses their ass. We are kissing their ass, right? And we're saying, hey, and use our country to do it. Turn us into the world's biggest floating aircraft carrier. And what that does, I'm sorry to break it to you, we already had a nuclear target on us in Pine Gap because Pine Gap is so central to a nuclear war. The way it guides America's drone murder machine is guided out of Pine Gap. But in a nuclear war, it's absolutely essential. And that straight away makes it a nuclear target in any nuclear exchange. But we start bringing nuclear subs here, and it's not just the nuclear subs will be ours. Now, they say they won't be nuclear equipped, but what happens in this area is we're not going to let the Indonesians or the Malaysians or the Chinese go down in those subs and inspect whether they've got nuclear missiles, are we? And so they just have to take our word for it. Well, guess what? Countries don't take each other's words for it in this regard. But it's not just the subs we have. We're opening up Australia to become a basis of increased American operations. Peter Dutton is a wannabe Mike Pompeo. I mean, you know, and just an obnoxious person to boot, because it's so easy to bash China in Australia now. You all lap it up. 80% of you hate China. You will accept anything if it comes in the name of bashing China, even putting us at risk, our region at risk, because China. China hasn't invaded anybody, hasn't participated in any wars. All it wants to do is do business. It's not going to be a doormat. This is not 1850 anymore, right? It's not going to be a doormat. And you know what else it's not going to do? It's not going to tolerate us changing the status of Taiwan. And that's the part that this is basic diplomacy that people have to wrap their heads around, Martin, because we accept the way Taiwan's talked about. Now, I'll tell you, I'll give you some basic brutal truths about Taiwan. China will never invade Taiwan. You know why? Because Taiwan is China. You cannot invade yourself. China accepts Taiwan as China. And you know who else accepts it? Taiwan accepts Taiwan as China. Now, Taiwan has the gall to say, well, China is us, right? But anyway, they all accept it. There's the KMT, who started Taiwan, who fled there after the Civil War. they were well on the way to almost a reunification with China. They're doing business. Taiwan, all its businesses with China, etc., doing all the business. America gets in there and stirs up a democracy movement in Taiwan. And you've got these younger Taiwanese people saying, we want to be independent, etc. And, because we're a liberal democracy. No, that doesn't matter. A country is not going to give up its territory. America fought its worst war, not World War I and World War II. Its worst war was still the Civil War, most bloodshed, because Abraham Lincoln wasn't going to let the South secede. And for the Chinese, Taiwan's status is the same. And when Henry Kissinger had his meetings with Zhou Enlai in the early 70s to open up relations with China, this was the non-negotiable. This issue. China would not talk. The Americans wanted to talk. China would not talk until America agreed, do not touch the status of Taiwan. You break that, you break the whole thing. So if we want a war, we know how to do it. You upset the status of Taiwan. All this stuff we accuse Xi Jinping of doing, making threats or whatever, she's making those threats not to Taiwan, to us. Leave Taiwan alone. This is the non-negotiable for our even being friendly with you guys in the West. We opened up on the basis of you accepting this status. You don't get to change it. Or if you do, there will be consequences. And if you can't fight a war against Afghanistan, you can come and fight a war here. We will go to war over it, but that's your choice. And we got these lunatics. One of the things that one of Mike Pompeo's last acts was to change the status of Taiwan. And if you don't believe me, go and look at, we can even put it on, I'll make a comment under the comments afterwards. You can listen to the link yourself. We like Singapore. Singapore is one of those Asian countries we tend to like. Go listen to the Singaporeans talk about this. Kishore Mahbubani, the former Singapore's ambassador to the UN, and George Yeo. It was in a podcast a couple of months ago. We published it. It's probably on our website as well. We published it. We transcribed it and published it. They explain just how fundamental this is. And our lunatic politicians, Peter Dutton, Mike Pompeo, and those jerks in America, we're upsetting the balance of that. And we're trying to say, that's Chinese aggression. No, this has always been the bedrock. And people have to learn this stuff, because if you just go by the way the media spins this, you're going to let them talk us into a war like you are, right? And you can do it, but I'm going to be fighting just as hard the other way, because the consequences are huge. It doesn't have to be this way. And one of the things we're going to do, Martin, we're going to do a bit more analysis on, the trigger for all this, what we're in right now, the trigger for this period is not what happened this month or the other week with the subs deal. It was when Barack Obama made his pivot to Asia after America literally destroyed the Middle East and North Africa, and he said, we're pivoting to Asia now to contain China. And Julia Gillard let him put the Marines in Darwin. And what they did is it massively upset the strategic balance. Those Marines in Darwin are called the tip of the spear. They're within striking distance to shut off the Straits of Malacca. And if you shut off the Straits of Malacca, you shut off China's oil supply. So the Chinese are working with this project with the Pakistanis to have a land supply through the Pakistani corridor, etc. And they're doing all sorts of things. But it was because we did that in 2011 that when Xi Jinping came to power, they started building up the islands in 2013 in response to what we did. Then we turn around and say, that's the aggression, because nothing we ever do is wrong, even though we had literally just blown up the Middle East. We'd done that. We've just turned Libya into a failed state. We've done that, right? But nothing we do is wrong. China's the aggressor. No, we upset the strategic balance. China responded, and that's what it's been like ever since. So we've done a big one with this damn subs deal. I was hoping that the one silver lining would be a domestic nuclear industry, yet that's not on. The only good thing that might come out about it is we get over our stupid fear of nuclear power and be able to, make use of our abundant resources of uranium and thorium in Australia. No, we can't do that. Instead, we have signed away what was left of our sovereignty and self-respect to this Anglo-American, being a permanent Anglo-American colony in our part of the world, and Australians have to see through it.
Yeah, Robbie, thank you. Off your long run, as I expected, which is why we put it towards the end of the show. We've gone way over time. A couple of comments came in from people saying, well, this will go on to 11 o'clock. But anyway, we haven't quite got there. But look, the point is, it's very important to get a balanced view on this, isn't there? And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that's, again, in the mainstream media is just taking one particular view. There was an interesting thing I saw on the ABC, I think it was last night. Stan Grant was interviewing somebody who is actually connected with China, and that person said, you got to understand there's now basically going to be a nuclear target on Australia, right, because of what you've done, right? And Stan couldn't believe it, but essentially the point is the world changed when that decision was made.
Yep, no, it did. And you do need to get a balanced point of view. So don't think of me, here's a bit of advice, don't necessarily think of me as the balance to say the Murdoch media on this. Think of just bother to pay attention to what our Asian neighbours are saying. You know, we've got to stop thinking our shit don't stink. We live in this world with neighbours. We're not more important than them. Think about what they're saying, right? And they're not all kissing China's butt, but they want a peaceful world, and we're the ones that are upsetting it. And the worst thing is, seriously, viewers, who really respects this current crop of politicians making this decision? Do you respect them in any other field of life? Like this guy, Scott Morrison, do you respect them? And you're gonna just lie down and think that these strategic decisions are somehow they're absolute morons and total bastards in literally everything they do to us domestically. But there must be some wisdom in this. That even if you fail to see it, it must be there. No, they are cretins. They're selling us our future down the river in every way, and they've just made the world a lot more dangerous. And they have some of them have some crazy religious ideas in their head, which are very dangerous. If they think God's on their side, I mean, that's the worst possible thing you can think in a time like this. And that's what anyway. Those things are terrible. So just weigh all that up and pay attention to what our Asian neighbours think. Mahathir gave us some advice recently, right, that we should act like we actually live here. This article I'm going to publish tomorrow by this former ambassador. He said, look, we could start to repair this relationship. Australia should restate its commitment to Taiwan's current status. Stop provoking China by implying that we're going to support a war to take Taiwan away from it. That sort of thing. It's not a betrayal of democracy. All this stuff is rubbish. These countries, all this stuff about, the Americans don't believe in democracy. The British don't believe in democracy. They'll overthrow a democracy as quick as they'll overthrow any other kind of system of government that's in their way, right? It's not about democracy. There's no special democratic club. That's all rubbish. This is all strategic games to serve this idea of an Anglo-American unipolar world. We need to reject it, see through it, and hey, once you see through that, you can actually admire the fact that, there are some countries in the world where the economy is actually moving ahead. Ours isn't one of them, and the country we tend to demonise the most is, right? And what does an economy moving ahead mean? Back to your original question.
Yep.
That people's lives improve.
Yep.
That's why the people of China haven't risen up and overthrown the terrible CCP. Their lives have materially improved over 40 years. And in that 40 years, who can honestly say Australians' lives have improved? I mean, superficially, we might have, like I said, flat screen TVs. We've got a lot more debt. We don't have a healthcare system that can serve us. We don't have manufacturing. Our lives haven't improved one iota. Take the stock of that.
And that's really the point. I know, and there will be people in the chat who won't disagree with what you're saying, Robbie. But the point is, these are the sorts of arguments that it's worth exploring, right? And DFA is about allowing these different perspectives to come through. I don't necessarily agree with everything that you've said tonight. I certainly don't agree with a lot of other people, what they've said on my other shows. But that's not the point. This is about a forum to have some of these conversations out there so that you begin to think differently and perhaps ask some broader questions, right? Because what I'm frustrated about, and this is, as we close, there is a huge potential for Australia and Australians if we got this sorted out, if we did the right things, if we actually had a strategic view of where we're going to head, and we started investing in the right things, and we used the pulled the levers in the right way rather than the long way, right? The last 20 to 30 years has been absolute disaster, right, in terms of not taking us to a future that is sustainable, nor is it one where the majority of Australians can really benefit. There has to be a different recipe, a different approach. And some of the things we've touched on here tonight, in my mind, are some of the DNA that we should be thinking about and talking about and pushing forward to effectively be able to turn the vision into a different perspective and real vision, and then follow through. And that's one of the things that I try and propagate on this channel, because I'm very, very passionate about wanting Australia to be the best it can be. And at the moment, it ain't.
And you do a good job. So thanks for the opportunity, Martin. And I might have been a bit intemperate earlier. I withdraw the term stupid in relation to the opposition to nuclear power. In case that might have offended anybody, I still think that's wrong opposition, but that's a debate perhaps to be won. But I got a bit intemperate there. But otherwise, no, this is a great forum. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for your time, Robbie. And look, there's a bunch of questions we didn't get to. We'll have to have you back on again. And I do want to go into more detail with regards to the whole power, energy,
Sure. Yeah, that was the original plan, wasn't it?
Well, that's where I started the conversation, but we sort of didn't quite get there when we actually fired off. But look, I think this was a really valuable conversation. We'll put links and things below if people want to. You guys.
Yeah, some of the things I mentioned, I'll link to.
Yep.
If anyone has a really burning question, when you do the post the video proper in the normal YouTube links questions, just put in the comments, and I do go through them the following day when I can, or in the next few days. I'll try and answer them directly, or at least say enough that you can hold it over till the next time, and I'll put some of the links of the things I mentioned.
Excellent, Robbie. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. And your passion comes through, of course, and people love it or hate it depending on which side of the fence they're on. But that's at least you don't just sit there blandly, spouting stuff. You've got.
I don't have an opportunity to, because for hours before the show starts, I'm getting pot shots from Cookie Boy on Twitter, and he's stirring me up for hours ahead, and I'm thinking I've got to keep this under control until the allotted time.
Yeah, well, you did very well. So thank you very much. I'm going to take you off stream now, and I'll close the show. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you again soon.
Definitely.
Cheers.
See you.
Bye-bye. Well, there you are, guys. That's pretty much it for tonight. Thank you very much for staying with us through to the end of the show. Just to tell you that next week it'll be an economic and market discussion with Damien Klassen, Investing Today. Very, very interesting time to have him on. We'll have a further update, of course, with what's happening in China and property and all the other things there. So join us this time next week for that show. I want to say thank you very much for spending your time with us this evening. I hope you found it an interesting and insightful discussion, even if you didn't agree with everything that Robbie said. That's not the point, as I said. Thank you very much for spending time. Please like the show. It's really important. And come back again next week and have another conversation with us on all things economic and market related. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. See you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Good night.